Well, we want to turn now to another, I can't even call it one issue, sort of compounding set of issues around working class people, the struggle around the right to have a roof over your head and all the things that come with that. And we are very, very honored to have with us here on the show Brian Goldstone, who's the author of There Is No Place for Us, Working and Homeless in America. Brian, thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, it's an honor to have you. I have to say the book is fantastic. I have to tip my hat to you. I haven't been as fired up and moved by something in some time. I want to get into a lot of aspects of the book, but I guess in some ways I want to start here. I think one of the things that you continually point to is that even what we know of as the homelessness crisis in America, which I think a lot of people have some sense of, especially if you live in a major city, is really an underplaying of how bad the situation is and how significant it's becoming. And I was hoping you could speak to that.
Absolutely. One argument that I try to make in this book, based on my reporting, is that as bad as the official numbers are, as sprawling as the tent encampments have become in many cities in America, the tents are just the tip of the iceberg. And in many ways, what my book is trying to document is everything that lies under the water surface, the rest of that humongous iceberg. And, what we see on the street is actually just a tiny sliver of America's total homeless population. And there's this entire world of homelessness that is not just out of sight physically, but has literally been rendered invisible by the federal government by defining people's experience of homelessness out of existence. And they literally don't count. Every year when the homeless census is conducted, none of the families I wrote about in this book would be counted. So there's this entire world of homelessness that we're not only not seeing, but if we were to take it seriously and confront it in its reality, it would force us to rethink our assumptions about both what causes homelessness and the kinds of solutions we need to really tackle this catastrophe at scale.
It's really incredible the words working homeless. I mean, because like you said, I mean the sort of stereotype in the American imagination of homelessness is like some drug addict who like really made really bad decisions in life,
Mhm.
or some lazy person who's just like, that's what happens to you. That's a consequence of just those things, right? Um,
That's right.
the idea that someone could have a job, in some cases, multiple jobs, um, and also still not be able to afford housing, it just blows my mind that that's even a term. So I guess, can you elaborate a bit on what that means? Like, how many people are we talking about here? Who is this impacting? Are these people with families? Are these people making minimum wage? Is it because the cost of housing is so expensive? And is this something that's new?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I think it's important to note that when I'm talking about the tents just being the tip of the iceberg, it's not to suggest that people living on the street are not in the formal labor force, that they're the lazy ones, that they're the irresponsible ones, that it's their own sort of individual pathologies that led them to become homeless. I cite a statistic in the book that even among those who are on the street or in shelters, in other words, those who are officially counted, about 40% of those on the streets are engaged in wage labor, and about 50% of those in shelters are engaged in wage labor. So even those who are visible are part of this kind of working homeless phenomenon, but we as a country have denied that reality because to put those two words together, working and homeless, is really to call into question some of the most fundamental beliefs that many Americans hold about their country, about the American dream, about that if you just work hard enough, you may not strike it rich, but you'll at least be able to have this sort of minimum standard of security or stability, this most basic human need, a roof overhead. And what my reporting shows in following these families over about 2 years is that people are working and working and working some more, and it's not enough. So we have to really reckon with the working side of that equation, the in working homeless. What is it about the changing nature of work in this country that has led it to be not enough? We're not only talking about poverty wages, but we're talking about the stripping away of labor protections and the ability to have sick leave. One family in my book, the mother is diagnosed with breast cancer and ovarian cancer, and she has to decide, is she going to go to her warehouse job and be able to keep her family in this squalid extended stay hotel room? Otherwise, they'll be on the street. Or is she going to go to her chemotherapy appointment? If she goes to the appointment, she doesn't have any sick leave, so she doesn't get paid. That's the kind of country we have made for ourselves. And so, yeah, that term working homeless, it kind of cuts to the heart. And I would argue, demythologizes much of what we have come to assume about work and homelessness slash extreme poverty alike.
Well, I'm glad you made the point about demythologizing because, I mean, the book, I couldn't put it down because you become so invested in the stories of people. I think for me, it felt because you can see yourself and people you know in every single person, and you just see like time after time after time. It's like, it's infuriating because you're just thinking like if they just had this one break or this one, it would have been fine, and you just get trapped in these cycles. And I was hoping you could just talk about that in terms of the way we approach this issue, because I think so often, people don't realize that it's, your house burning down or like, you just things that are just happening. But once you're in there, you're trapped, and then there's really no intervention to help you sort of get out. But anyway, I don't know exactly where I'm going with there, but I thought it was a crucial part of the book.
Well, yeah, and I appreciate using the language of trapped because these five families who I followed over a period of about 2 years, they find themselves trapped in a brutal cycle of precarity and homelessness. And it's important to use the word brutal here. I use that intentionally because at every turn in their journey, there are actors who are profiting off of their insecurity. There are entire business models that are capitalizing on this precarity, and I think that the kind of profit motive behind housing insecurity in America is so I mean, not to put too fine a point on it, but ludicrously left out of the conversation about housing and homelessness. The power asymmetry that exists between landlords and tenants in this country. So you mentioned, a family whose house burns down. That's a very dramatic beginning to their story. An abusive ex burns down the house of this mother and her children. And and it's easy to read that story and say, oh, well, they became homeless because their house burned down. No, they became homeless because their landlord was a private equity firm that, in a state like Georgia, was able to file an eviction on this family because they refused to pay rent on a house that had burned down. Not only the current month's rent, but the next month's rent as well in order to break their lease. When they refused to do that, they went on their way and they continued their search for housing. And when the mother finally applies for an apartment, she learns that months earlier, this private equity firm filed an eviction against her, unbeknownst to her. In Georgia, you're allowed to do what's called a tack and mail dispossessory notice. So you don't even have to be informed in person that you were evicted. On the eviction notice, the sheriff wrote, served to fire damaged property, and left it in the mailbox. Months later, this mother, Celeste, finds out that an eviction has been handed down. The judge, in her absence, handed down a default judgment, and her credit score was tanked. This three-digit number, this credit score that has come to determine whether Americans have access to things like housing or healthcare or any number of other things, was tanked, and they became trapped in this cycle. So I think the language of trapped is important, and we have to be talking about exploitation. We have to be talking about power. This is not just about not having enough housing units.
I a few years back, I made this kind of mini documentary on homeless families in Washington, D.C. And it was specifically single moms. There was these homeless single mothers with children. And I mean, DC gets really cold too, like in the winter time. And there is some shelters, but they're actually not easy to get into. I'm sure you know all of this because you know the homelessness crisis. But I guess I say that to ask, how much of this is kids? How much of this is families with kids?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to talk about this without getting emotional. This is one of the earliest conversations I've been able to have, but it's very hard to talk about this. And I think we should stop and get choked up and not talk about kids who are experiencing this kind of homelessness in this abstract way. It was utterly heartbreaking to witness what these children went through in for such utterly preventable reasons, right? Because it was profitable for someone to put this child's family through what they went through. Their futures were literally being strangled, right? That public health researchers use this phrase toxic stress to describe what happens to children over the long term, over the course of their lives, when they don't have access to just these basic human necessities. And when they don't know when they leave school each day, are they going to be sleeping in a Walmart parking lot that night with their mom? And in the morning, bathing, so to speak, in the sink of that Walmart, while their mom is terrified that the police are going to knock on her window in the middle of the night and call Child Protective Services and take those children away. In Georgia, over a third of child removals in the state are because of inadequate housing, right? So that same Child Protective Service agency refuses to give these families housing assistance to keep them in their homes. But once you lose your home, you can have your children taken away. So at every step, these kids are experiencing pretty acute trauma. And I'm still trying to come to terms with that.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you. It's hard to wrap your head around, and even to put yourself in the place of some of these young folks in the book, and the things that they have to do to try to, also keep their family afloat at such a young age, 10, 12 years old, having to watch after younger kids, the shame of, should I be working? Should I drop out of school? I mean, it's so many different pieces. And I think the other thing that I really appreciate about the book in a way is the COVID crisis and the impact that had on education and learning and so many different things. And I guess I just use that to sort of transition a little bit here to my next question is, to meet this problem, what do we need? Because I think the point you make is so right. Like, it's not just about enough housing units. Like, the other thing that comes up a lot is the role of domestic violence and housing insecurity. I mean, what's the holistic way of really pushing forward on this?
There's so many systems that are interlocking here to make this crisis possible. So many uniquely American maladies, like a lack of healthcare. In Georgia, one of the families in the book, the mother gets to the point where she is at sort of a breaking point emotionally and psychologically, and finally works up the courage to reach out for a therapist. And when she calls the Medicaid number, she's told, sorry, your form of Medicaid only covers family planning, sterilization, birth control. You don't have access to any mental health services. If she lived in, say, Massachusetts, she would have access to. So you have so many interlocking maladies here that are militating against the stability of these families. But I want to be really clear that this isn't, I'm frustrated sometimes reading about homelessness in America, because at the end of an article or a movie or whatever, you're almost given a sense of like, well, who's to say what caused their homelessness? Was it their misfortune? Was it their proclivity to drink? Was it the domestic violence? All of those things become risk factors, right? All of those things might make you a little less likely, including, we should mention, your race. Like, there's a cliche that anyone can fall into homelessness in America. Well, the fact that 93% of families in Atlanta who experience homelessness are Black in a no longer Black majority city tells us that no, some people are a little more likely to become homeless than others for historical reasons, for political reasons, for economic reasons. This isn't just sort of a you slip and fall into homelessness sort of thing. But it's very important to be clear that at the root of all of this is a paradigm that is a status quo that says that housing is a commodity, it's a vehicle for wealth accumulation, and that the few who are lucky enough to own property in this country will invariably profit at the expense of the many, many, many more who are just in need of a place to live. And we've allowed housing to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. And we call that the market. We call that the private market. We call it supply and demand. During the pandemic, you mentioned COVID, there was so much outrage when people were hoarding hand sanitizer and N95 masks, right? And then they were selling them on eBay for like $90 a pop. That's what we've allowed housing to become in this country. We've allowed this absolutely essential resource to be hoarded And the government just sort of says, well, whoever's lucky enough to get it, that's great. Everyone else, you're left to fend for yourself. And yeah, and that has to change fundamentally.
Well, I have to say, everyone has to read this book. There is no place for us working in homeless in America. Even if you think you know, you need to read this book. Crucially important. Brian, I really appreciate you writing the book and being willing to share some of your time with us here on the Freedom Side.
It means the world to me to be able to speak to you. So thank you so much.